Okay, Lisa, welcome to the show. I suppose a question I'm curious to ask to get started would be, what is your theory of emotions, and how does this conflict with the classical view of emotions?
Sure, I'm really happy to be here, so thank you. I should say at the outset that when I talk about a theory, I'm not really talking about just a set of ideas. I'm talking about a set of ideas that have a lot of scientific evidence to back them up. So, let's actually start with the classical view, because I think that's a little easier for people to understand. It's probably a lot of people's intuition, which is the idea that each of us is born with a set of circuits that are pre-wired, that come, from some long evolutionary history, either from, our hunter-gatherer past or even much further back than that. So one for anger, one for fear, one for sadness, and so on. And that something happens in the world and it triggers a circuit, say for fear. So you see a snake or you see a horror movie or something, it triggers your circuit for fear, and you have a set of physical changes in your body. You make a very diagnostic facial expression, like a wide-eyed gasping face, like, and that you feel dread, and right, that there's this whole, almost obligatory set of consequences to triggering that circuit. And if some of those things don't happen, let's say you don't make that set of facial movements, or your heart rate doesn't, increase, or your breathing rate doesn't speed up, whatever, it's because some other set of mechanisms came in and influenced the outputs of the circuit, right? So that maybe you live in a culture where there are very strong rules for how you express emotion. And so that would be an extra set of mechanisms. Or maybe you engaged in emotion regulation, and that would be an extra set of mechanisms, right? But the idea is that probabilistically, there's going to be a whole ensemble of physical changes in the body, in your face, in the parts of the brain that create experience, and that these are routinely consistent enough across instances of fear that we could just measure them objectively and diagnose you as being in a state of fear. And this ensemble, a fingerprint, you could say, or a signature, for fear, would be consistent across people, across cultures, across instances, maybe even across animals. That's the general idea. And it's an idea that is very consistent with the broader view of how psychology theorizes and understands mental life, right? So the idea that there are these modules in your brain that are very separate for different categories of psychological events, for thinking, for problem solving, for decision making, for attention, for various kinds of attention, for various kinds of memory. Every word corresponds to a module in your brain with its own circuit that produces its own set of outcomes. And there's not a lot of evidence for that view. And I will say that in the history of psychology, people have been pushing back against that view really since psychology became a science in the mid to late 18th century. So the great William James, who's considered one of the founding, parents, if you will, of American psychology, really pushed back against that view. And he lost that battle. And actually, sequentially throughout history, the history of the field, you can see people pushing back against that view because the data never support that view. And that was the really surprising thing to me, actually, is to realize that this whole journey that my lab and my collaborators and I have been on about the science of emotion, not only has been traversed before, but also in other fields, like subfields of psychology. And so instead, our view is really one that's very data driven. We're taking our lead from the century and a half or so worth of evidence, which suggests that emotions don't happen to you. They're not something that's just triggered in your brain and perfunctory. They're made by your brain. They're made by you. They're constructed by you out of, mechanisms that are what we would call domain general, meaning that the mechanisms that construct emotion also construct your thoughts, construct your memories, they construct your perceptions. They're really kind of all-purpose computational mechanisms. And the general idea is that your brain is always, first of all, your brain doesn't react to things in the world, it's predicting. It's always using past experience to try to guess what's going to happen next. And those guesses are, your brain basically changing the firing of its own neurons to prepare for sights and sounds and smells and physical changes in the body. So I think that's the first thing to understand, is that your brain is predicting, it's not reacting. And those predictions really are what we would call memory or knowledge. They're based on the past, what's happened in the past. Your brain is making a pretty good guess of what's going to happen in a moment from now. And it starts by guessing what actions you have to take and what physical changes in your body have to occur in order for you to perform those actions. So your brain starts with movement. It starts by making a guess about what movements need to happen in the next instance. And actually what you perceive and experience is a consequence of those changes. So another difference, right, is between, our work and the sort of classical view is the classical view assumes that there's a stimulus occurs and it triggers something in you, and then you produce a response. But actually what the evidence suggests is that your brain is using past experiences to make a guess about what to do next. So it's preparing the response first. And then there are copies, literal neuronal copies. They're called efferent copies or corollary discharge. They have a couple of names in the neuroscience literature. That the neurons that prepare your physical changes in the next moment actually send collateral axons to the parts of your brain that are important for vision and for audition and for, right? And so your brain is basically guessing. It's like, well, based on what's happened in a similar situation in the past, when I prepared this movement, what did I see next? What did I hear next? What did I smell next? What did I feel next? That's actually, right? So your experience is a consequence of your brain's regulation of your body. It doesn't come first, it comes second. And then the final piece is that, well, where does this knowledge come from? So when your brain is constructing an instance of fear or an instance of anger or an instance of ligut or an instance of any emotion category that you're familiar with and that or even one that you don't know, maybe it's combining pieces of emotions, like, Schadenfreude, right, was something that Americans didn't know, which is sort of a feeling pleasure at somebody else's misfortune, but also a little guilt, right? And so there's like a mix of a bunch of different, US categories for emotion. And so in that case, your brain is combining bits and pieces of the past from different instances, different categories of emotion to predict what to do next and what's going to happen next. And so where does that knowledge come from? And the answer is it comes from your past. It comes from your experience, because infant brains are not miniature adult brains. They're brains that are wired. They need wiring instructions from the world to finish wiring themselves. And some of those wiring instructions teach the infants the categories for all kinds of culture-specific experiences and actions. And so, of course, emotion knowledge is hardwired into your brain. It's just not it's not the transfer of information from one generation to the next isn't by genes alone. It's by genes that make the brain open to the world, right? So that the brain can wire itself to specific environments, to specific cultural contexts. So the transfer of information is called cultural inheritance, which is how humans learn a lot of stuff. And so those are just some of the ideas that we work with that are backed up by, considerable amounts of data, I would say. And as you can tell, the theoretical perspective draws from evolutionary biology and cultural evolution, and it draws from, developmental neuroscience and from psychology. And, it's in order to answer the question of how a brain creates a mind, you need to draw from a lot of different literatures.
Okay, I think we can end the interview there.
I know, I tend to, it's hard. The beauty of the classical view is that you can just sort of, say it in like a sentence or two. But this idea that your brain is a meaning maker, and it's taking in sense data from all the sensory surfaces of your body and combining those signals with signals from your past, that is memories, and that mixture is ongoing through your whole life. And that's really the basis for every experience you have, every action you take. It requires like a lot more background knowledge and setup. So it's not really easy to, give like a 2-sentence answer to the question. Or, if you do, it doesn't really answer anything. Like, emotions are, constructed perceptions, or, emotions are predictions. That doesn't really explain, how emotions are made, really, unless you already have that background knowledge.
100%. So in preparing for this, whenever I did start to sort of grasp the idea even slightly, I sort of had the sense that my word was sort of being turned upside down a little bit. This is a serious implications, this idea. And a sentence in the book that really helped to sort of help me grasp it was along the lines of, emotions are your brain's construction of what bodily sensations mean in a specific context. And in the book, you use an example of when you were a postgraduate student, or whenever you were younger, you went on a date in a coffee shop. And you want to tell us about that?
True story.
That really helped for me to understand it. So if you maybe could tell us about that example, I think that could be helpful for people.
Sure. So the important thing to understand is that physical signals in your body, like a change in heart rate or a change in breathing or an increase in cortisol, or, these changes have no inherent psychological meaning. They have to be made meaningful. Those signals have to be made meaningful in an ensemble of other signals. And some of those signals come from the world, like what's happening outside you right now. And some of those signals are only in your brain. That is, they are memories from the past that your brain is reassembling. And you don't have the experience of remembering, but that's really what your brain is doing. It's reassembling, reconstructing the representations from the past. It's like reinstituting them. And this is always true, because we don't experience this on a regular basis. And you have to come up with, there are examples that we can come up with to sort of show people in talks and in classrooms and so on. But for me, a really good example was, I was a graduate student, and there was this guy who kept asking me out for coffee, and, I just wasn't that interested. And, but he persisted. And finally I thought, well, okay, I'll just go out with him once and, get this over with, and then maybe he'll leave me alone. And so we went out for coffee. And as we were having coffee, I noticed that I started to feel a little warm, like my cheeks were a little flushed and I felt kind of warm. And also I felt kind of jittery, like a little like worked up, a little on edge, like a little fluttery. And also I was, I was having a little trouble. Like I felt kind of foggy headed a little bit, not a lot, but just a little bit. And I thought, so what I wondered was, I thought, well, maybe I'm attracted to this guy, actually. Like maybe I do like him, like maybe what I'm feeling is, so this was a situation where I wasn't like really sure, well, what were these sensations that I was experiencing? And I thought, well, okay, I'm on a date, right? So maybe I am really interested in this guy. And so we, he took me home after this coffee, and we made plans to see each other again. And I opened the door to my apartment, closed the door, put the keys, down, and ran to the bathroom, and let's just say, prayed to the porcelain gods, as it were. And then I was in bed for a week with the flu. So probably the biological source of those sense data were a virus that was starting to infect my system. But my brain made sense of those sensations as attraction and lust. And you can say, well, your brain was mistaken, but my brain wasn't mistaken, because my brain did what it always does, which is it makes sense of the experience. It made sense of the sense data to create an experience. So the experience isn't a mistake, it's the experience, right? And I ended up dating this guy for about 9 months. And in the end, we broke up, and I probably could have saved myself, 9 months of misery, I think, if I had realized that. I really hope he never recognizes himself in that description. But I'll say that, here's another example, right? Right before the pandemic, literally days before it was announced, I guess it was probably going on at that point, but it hadn't been officially announced. I was in New Zealand, and I was on a book tour. So I was talking, at universities about my research. And then I was also in a book, at this book festival, and talking about my books. And my daughter was planning to fly. She was flying over from Boston to New Zealand because it was spring break, and we were going to travel around for a week or so. And as she's in the air, and it's a pretty long flight to get from the US to New Zealand, as she's mid-flight, I'm listening to news stories about infections are on the rise, and everywhere. And I'm thinking to myself, and I'm starting to, my heart rate's going up, and I'm starting to feel sweaty, and I'm thinking to myself, should I meet her at the airport and turn around and take her home, or should we have our vacation? Because at that point there were really, I think 4 or 5 infections in Auckland, and we were on the South Island. Anyways, point being that my brain could have very easily constructed anxiety in that moment out of all those sense data. But what I did was I constructed a different experience, which was curiosity, because I was just uncertain. What was, when your brain can't make a good prediction, it increases the production of certain neurochemicals that will help you learn better, kind of learn prediction error, learn the stuff that you didn't predict so that you can predict better the next time. And when that happens, you experience it often as an increase in arousal, your body is jittery, and it's easy. Our kind of go-to explanation for that is anxiety. And so we experience those sensations as anxiety, but they could be determination. They could be uncertain, just simple uncertainty. And why does it matter? Is this like just a bunch of Jedi mind tricks? Like, why does it matter what you construct out of those sensations? And the answer is because it determines what you do next. If I had created anxiety in that moment, I would have done something very different than if I had just created uncertainty. And right, so one involves withdrawal usually, and the other involves foraging for information. And foraging for information was exactly what I thought I should be doing in that instance. And I'm making this sound very deliberate. And in the case that I'm describing, it was deliberate. I was using what I know about the neuroscience of the brain to influence my actions and my experience. But most of the time, for most of us, our brains just do this kind of stuff automatically. This is the stuff that where actions come from and where experiences come from.
There's so much in there. I don't even know where to start. But so just going back to so basically our bodily sensations, that's affect, and that is basically raw material. And then our previous experiences causes our brains to predict what those bodily sensations mean in a specific context. So could you maybe help us distinguish between affect and emotions, make that clear distinction? And then I'd be curious to ask as well, how do you think about things like grief and things like loneliness? Is that affect? Is that emotion? What are your thoughts there about those things?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to answer your question, the first thing we have to understand is that the brain's most important job is not thinking, it's not feeling, it's not seeing, it's regulating the systems of your body. So you have a lot going on inside your body. So do I, so do all our listeners right now. There's a whole drama going on inside there. Lots and lots and lots of systems. They all have to be coordinated in a metabolically efficient way for you to stay healthy. And there's this constant transaction that's going on always throughout your entire life. Your brain sends predictions, sends, neural commands to the body, and the body sends sense data back to the brain constantly. That dialogue is going on all the time. And we're mostly your brain doesn't make itself aware of that. So if you're aware of all that drama going on inside your body, something's seriously wrong. And you're probably really suffering from discomfort, because most of the time, we're completely unaware. Maybe occasionally, we'll run up the stairs or drink too much coffee and we'll feel our heart pounding against our chest. But even then, you're not actually literally feeling your heart beat. You're feeling your heart vibrate. The pounding is the vibration of your heart against your bone, the bony part of your chest. And that's what you're feeling, right? So really, and everything you feel, you're feeling in your brain. You don't feel things in your body, just like you don't see in your eyes. You see, in your brain. You hear, if you pinch yourself, you feel that pinch in your brain, okay? There's this whole, symphony of sense data that is moving up your spinal cord to your brain. But we're not wired to be aware of all those sensations. So if you think about vision, like, high definition TV, then the sensory condition of your body is kind of like black and white TV from the 1950s with a bad antenna in the rain. Like you get like these vague feelings, like I'm feeling pleasant, I feel unpleasant, I'm feeling worked up, I'm feeling calm, I feel comfortable, I feel uncomfortable. That's affect, or sometimes people call it mood. But basically it's this ever-present feeling. Are things okay? Are things not okay? Right? Am I feeling really worked up? Am I feeling really sleepy? That's affect. It's with you 24/7, all the time, even when you sleep. right? You're feeling it. And you're basically, your brain isn't really wired and isn't really wired to make itself aware of the hundreds, if not thousands, of sensory signals that are arriving all the time. And the ones that we can be aware of, we're not usually aware of them unless something is really wrong. Mostly what our brains do is make the state of the body available as affect, as these sort of simple physical feelings that are always with us all the time. So, and there's not one cause of affect, right? Because affect arises from this whole drama going on inside us. It's like a very basic summary. So it's not tied to any one thing, right? It arises, we would say in computer science terms or engineering terms, we would say it's a low dimensional feature, meaning there's a lot of information that's being compressed into a single summary. And that summary doesn't have a lot of detail to it. And what our brains are doing is making sense. It's that brains don't make sense of affect, really. They make sense of the sense data that give rise to affect. So your brain is making sense of all of the sense data coming from here in the context of all the sense data coming from out here, what you see and smell and hear and taste, in relation to the past. Because your brain, is in a dark, silent box, your skull, called your skull. It's receiving sense data, which are the outcomes. They're the effects of some set of causes, but your brain doesn't have access to the causes. It only has access to the outcomes. So a flash of light or a change in air pressure. So a flash of light, what is that flash of light? Could be many different things. Or, you hear a big bang, let's say. What's the bang? Is it a door slamming? Is it thunder? Is it, a car backfiring in the United States? Is it a gunshot? I'm assuming you don't have the same kind of situation with guns in Ireland that we have right here, where, let's don't even get me started. But the point being that your brain has to guess. And that's what predictions are. They're guesses. They're guesses based on past experience. So, affect is a feature of consciousness. It arises because of your brain's main job, which is to regulate your body. And sometimes your brain will conjure an emotion while it's making sense of the sense data, but sometimes it conjures what we would conceive of as a thought or a perception. Right? Somebody cuts you off on the highway and your experience is, what an asshole. Well, there's affect right there in your perception of that person as being an asshole, right? Assholeness doesn't live in that person. I mean, maybe that person is an asshole, but maybe that person is rushing to the hospital to see a sick parent, or maybe that person is rushing to pick up their kids from daycare, or, maybe they just didn't see you, or, they're basically, affect is always with you all the time. And constantly we sort of look to the world to explain those sensations, but they have many, or to explain the sensations that affect is based on, but they have many different causes. And only sometimes is affect, emotion, not always.
100%. So in the book, you talk about, you were talking there about how affect is kind of, it's blurry, it's amorphous, it's hard to sort of figure out what's actually going on there. But in the book, you talk around, if we want to make things more HD, emotional granularity can really help. And I think I heard you say one example where if a person only has two words like happy and sad, that person is like 1,000,000 times more likely to suffer from things like depression than somebody that's got a rich vocabulary for those concepts. So could you maybe tell us a bit more about emotional granularity and why this is important to understand?
Sure. So when you're feeling bad, what do you do?
I think about what has caused me to feel this way so that
Well, right. But why are you why are you trying to figure out what has caused you to feel this way? Because you don't know what to do. And you're trying to figure out the cause in order to know what to do. Feeling bad doesn't tell you anything about what to do. Emotions, like every event that your brain creates, are prescriptions for action. So if you understand that bad feeling as coming from, right? So if I understood that bad feeling that I was experiencing as being anxiety, I would do one set of things. And if I understood it as being curiosity, I would do a different set of things. Or here's an example. People who have test anxiety have very negative affect, very negative, high arousal, negative feelings. They can't pass tests. They sometimes actually have to drop out of a class. Sometimes they drop out of school entirely. And that can change their earning potential for their entire lives, like by hundreds of thousands of dollars. But they can learn to create a feeling of determination out of those sensations, right? So instead of the affect being conjured into anxiety, it's conjured into determination. My daughter's sensei, when she was 12 years old, had this great phrase, get your butterflies flying in formation, which I just thought was brilliant. And people learn to do it. So they're not learning to turn down the arousal, because you need the arousal for learning. Like you need the arousal to move your body. You need the arousal to do what you need to do. So you're not changing the arousal, you're changing the meaning of it. And by learning to experience arousal as determination, people do actually pass tests and they do finish college. And that, has a long-term benefit in their lives. That's an example of improving emotional granularity. Basically, the more concepts that you know for emotion, the more flexibility you have to make sense of sense data in a way that is actionable in specific situations. So concepts are tools for action. They're tools for living. That when your brain is remembering something from the past, that is conjuring an event from the past in order to make predictions about what's going to happen next, what you're going to do next, what you're going to feel next. It's constructing a concept out of your past experience. The more concepts your brain can construct, the more flexibility you have in your action. And that's going to make you a more effective person. So the idea of emotional granularity is that you have more granular experience, meaning you're not if you're generalizing too much from the past, like too many, like for example, if you survey so many events, the only thing they have in common is that they felt bad. That's not telling you very much information about what you need to do next. You need something more precise. You need to generalize in a more precise way from the past, not just on negativity, but on other features as well. And that's what emotional granularity, that's a description of what emotional granularity is. And the idea that people who are more granular can cope better and are less likely to become depressed and, actually recover from cancer and other physical illnesses faster. All of that is research in the literature. I mean, like it's remarkable actually, but because concepts are tools for regulating your body and preparing action in ways that are situated. So the more flexibility you have, the more you know, the more variety, the bigger your menu is, the more flexibility you have. And in the end, that is a good thing for you.
That's so interesting. So earlier you mentioned that, you know, our brain is essentially locked in a dark skull, and it has to guess what's going on in the outside world, and it does that through past experiences and uses those past experiences to make predictions. And what this, I can't wrap my head around this, but it's just the idea that everything that we're seeing is a concept based on what we've previously seen and experienced. And we had a talk from, I don't know if you're aware of his work, Ian McGilchrist. Do you know him?
I don't know him personally, but I know his work. Mm-hmm.
And in his talk, he said the left hemisphere, or pretty much everything that we see, is a representation. And the way he slowed it down, he said everything is a representation of something that we've seen before. So are we walking around, we're not actually seeing what's there, we're seeing our brain's concept of what's there? And yeah, could you maybe expand upon that?
Sure. So the neuroscientist Gerald Edelman coined a phrase, the remembered present, which I think is a beautiful phrase because it really captures the one of the basic kind of computational aspects of brain function, which is that when you see, or when you hear, or when you have any experience at all, when you move your body in any way, it's a combination of the sense data from the world, the sense data from your body, and some signals that are reconstituted in your brain from the past. So I have this image in the book, and I've done this in my TED Talk also. I do it very frequently with audiences because it always gets a gasp. Like, people are always surprised. Like, I just show a blobby image. Right now, there are wavelengths of light coming from the screen, hitting your retina. And so most people, what they see are black and white blobs. So what do you see there? Do you see an image of an object, or do you just see black and white blobs?
I see black and white blobs.
Yeah, and your brain is really trying using past experience to come up with a concept, which is a set of neural firing from the past to make sense of this. But right now, mostly what's happening is you've got these sense data coming from the world, and only from the world. All you see are black and white blobs. If your brain can't come up with a good representation from the past to make sense of these blobs, then all you see are this blobby image. And what you're experiencing is something called experiential blindness. So what philosophers called experiential blindness. And so I'm going to cure your blindness now. And I'm going to do it again. And so many people now, well, what do you now see, Niall? What do you see when you look at this image?
I'm seeing a bee.
You see a bee. And why? Because now your brain has new knowledge to create these prediction signals, which you create a concept, thanks to the color photograph that I just showed you. And those signals in your brain change how you experience those blobs on the screen right now. So your brain is constructing the image of a bee so that you see a bee, even though there actually is no bee present on the screen. So that is how your brain really works. And I'll give you another example. So what do you see now? What are you seeing?
I'm not sure if I don't have a concept for these things. Electrical pylons, would they be?
Yeah, sure. Electrical pylons, electrical towers. What are they doing?
Two of them have got like a jump rope, and they're moving it round, and the pylon in the middle is jumping up the same way like kids would do.
Right. So I'll wager that you've never actually seen electrical towers playing jump rope in real life, but
Never.
you can understand that's what's happening here because your brain is able to combine bits and pieces of past experience to make a completely novel concept, a completely novel set of predictions.
Mm.
So predictions are, in effect, assembled memories, even though most of the time you don't experience yourself remembering anything, like I said before. So there's something else, though, that this example demonstrates, and that is, can you hear the towers hitting the ground?
No.
No. Can you feel the thudding of the towers? Can you feel it in your chest?
Nope.
So you just see towers jumping. You don't feel any thuds, or you don't hear any thuds.
Nope.
Okay. Well, when I look at this visual image, I hear the towers hitting the ground. And I also feel the thudding in my chest. I feel the vibration of the towers in my chest. And that's because these the visual sense data are actually not just when my brain is making sense of the towers jumping, the visual input from this image, it's also changing the firing of my auditory and somatosensory neurons in the absence of those sensory inputs, merely on the basis of the visual input. So prediction signals are not just abstract things, they're actually, starting to create the sensations. They're the firing of neurons that start to prepare the sensations in advance of anticipating the sensory inputs that are actually about to come. So the idea here, and again, idea backed up by a lot of data, is that everything that you see is a combination of what's out there in the world and what's in your head. Everything you hear is a combination of what's outside in the world and what's in your head. That old puzzle, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it hit the ground, does it make a sound? The answer is no, it doesn't. It doesn't make a sound. It changes, the tree falls and it hits the ground, and that changes the vibrations in the of the airwaves. But you need some kind of transducer to make it into a sound. And you need a concept of a tree falling in order to make it into the sound of a tree falling, right? Otherwise, to you, you're just experientially blind to, let's say you don't have that concept, but you have an ear, then you're experientially blind to the meaning of that sound. And if you don't have an ear, you don't even hear the sound. Right? So when you're listening to somebody else talk in a language that you don't speak, and to you, it just sounds like, a bunch of sounds that have no meaning, you're experientially blind because you don't have the prior knowledge to make sense of those sense data. So what Ian McGilchrist was saying is that everything you experience in your whole life has to be a combination of what's happened in the, signals in your brain that your brain is reconstituting from the past, not just in your left hemisphere. But that's my piece, is it's not just in your left hemisphere, it's happening in your whole brain. And the sense data coming from the world. And the sense data coming from your body are also important in that equation as well.
Okay, now, what are the implications of this on personal responsibility, and what are your thoughts on free will as well?
Well, I can't really do justice to a complicated question about free will in the few minutes that we have left, but here's what I'll say, that if you want to change who you are, or you want to change your actions in some way, you can't very easily reach back into your past and change your past. I mean, we try to do that in psychotherapy, for example, right? We try to change our understanding of the past. That everything that you experience today becomes, everything that you do today, everything you experience today becomes a past that your brain will draw on in the future to make predictions and to very automatically and effortlessly control your actions and construct your experience. So if you invest effort today to give yourself new experiences, to try new things, to learn new things, you're basically seeding your brain to predict differently in the future. And we're very familiar with doing that kind of thing, right? So we exercise now. We invest a lot of energy in exercising because it will, make us, a healthier, keep us healthy, right? A better, stronger you in the future. We invest in learning skills, like we learn to play the piano, or we learn to drive, or we learn to, do mathematics, or we learn, can learn any number of things, right? Program a computer. And the things that are hard at the beginning, that are very effortful at the beginning, if we practice them enough, they become very effortless and very automatic. Driving a car is a really good example. And it's the same thing with seeding your brain to predict differently. If you cultivate new experiences, curate new opportunities for yourself to learn, you're investing energy. It's an investment of resources. But if you practice them, it can become pretty automatic. And that's a way of changing your behavior in a very, it's effortful at the beginning, but eventually it becomes effortless. You're basically creating an opportunity. Your brain is creating an opportunity for itself to have more granularity. And what this means is that, in effect, we are somewhat responsible for ourselves, we are responsible for our actions, even when something bad happens to us. And this is the thing that I think people find most compelling, actually, about this view. And that is, if something really bad happens to you and you're a victim of something bad happens that you have no control over, you're not culpable for all the bad things that happened, right? It's not your fault, but you are responsible for fixing it. Not because anything is your fault, but because you're the only one who can fix it, right? You're the only one. If you have experienced something traumatic in your life, it's kind of like you're victimized twice, right? First, the actual bad thing happens to you, and then you have to suffer the consequences of those. And then you learn you're the only one who can fix those consequences. It feels very unfair. And it is unfair, but it's also kind of inspiring, right? Because it means that you actually can take the reins of your own life. Even though you're not culpable, you're not blameworthy, you are responsible, merely because sometimes we're responsible for things only because we're the only ones that can fix those things. And that's why we're responsible for them. So I worked with people who experienced trauma as children for several years, and their journey was first feeling that it was unfair that things work this way, and then feeling like hopeful and inspired and grateful for the opportunity to kind of take the reins of their own life. So it is a kind of free will, in a sense, that you can harness the automatic nature the way your brain works by feeding yourself different experiences. So there are many, many ways that we can learn from each other. I mean, one of the things that makes humans very special like our special gift. Like we have, every animal in the whole world has special things they can do. And our special thing, one of our special things, is we learn from each other. I mean, other animals learn from each other too, but we really have perfected the capacity to learn from each other in very efficient ways. That's what one of the things that language gives us, is the ability. I can just tell you something. I can say, Niall, I had pizza for dinner the other day, and I put, cauliflower and olives on it. It was delicious. Well, now you don't have to go and, try it 15 times to learn it. You can just now do it because I told you about it. I mean, in a very, right, I said pizza. So I didn't say, Niall, for dinner, a meal that I had in the evening was this piece of dough that had sauce on it with some cheese, but I removed the cheese and instead I put, this, like these little, I don't know what are olives, actually, I guess berries, these little berries, and I removed the seeds and I, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I don't have to say all those things. I just went, Niall, I had pizza last night with olives and cauliflower. It was delicious. You should try it. Very efficiently, I've just taught you something with like a few words that have hundreds of features. But because you and I know what olives are, I'm assuming we know what olives are, and we know what cauliflower is, and we know what pizza is, right? Or, anything works that way, right? So I can say, well, the next time, I don't know, I'm trying to think, like, then I don't know. I'm trying to think of something I could give you advice for, but I don't really know you very well. So, basically we're constantly learning from each other. We learn from each other by observation, for better or for worse. And just by watching somebody else do something, that's why YouTube is so, popular. We just can watch somebody do something and then we've learned something about how to do it. This is something that other animals do too, but we do it, we do it just excessively well. This is something I talk about in my other book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. And I give lots of examples there. And so that is a kind of free will. I mean, it's very hard to, change gears in the moment. But if so your brain prepares you to do an action and then, puts the brakes on so that you have to stop it. But and then attempt to do something different. That's actually really, really hard to do. But if your brain has the flexibility to, right? So if my brain constructs anxiety and then I want to deconstruct it and try to, experience determination or curiosity instead, that's actually really hard. But if my brain has the capacity to choose amongst those options to begin with, then it can just go straight to determination or straight to curiosity without all of the undoing, which is very effortful and very, very difficult. So in a sense, this is a way in which we can take more responsibility, can kind of capitalize or benefit from the responsibility that we have being responsible for ourselves and exert free will in a way that is a little easier actually than the traditional way that it's discussed.
100%. Well, Lisa, I know you need to go. Just want to say, I think we would probably need 10 interviews to try and even scratch the surface on the work that you've done over the years. Definitely get the book. Anybody listening, where's the best for people to get the books and find out more about your work online?
Yep, they can go to my website. My public website is lisafeldmanbarrett.com. And there are links to all kinds of opportunities for reading articles and listening to podcasts that are all free. And then you can also, there are also opportunities to purchase the book. In the UK, both books are published by Macmillan. So you can actually get right to their website, or or any of the traditional booksellers to purchase the book.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much for your time today and sharing some of your wisdom and knowledge with us. I really appreciate it, and I wish you
Oh,
the
it's
best
my
going
pleasure.
forward.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on your show.